Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
An especially big day for President Joe Biden as he prepares to do what he promised he would when he put out that statement announcing he was no longer seeking re-election this past weekend. Address the nation from the Oval Office about his decision. But this may not just be about his decision to leave the race. It also could be about his legacy, what he wants to continue to accomplish while he's still sitting in that office. And of course, it might be a little bit about his vice president and now presumptive Democratic nominee, Kamala Harris, as well. So as we look ahead to this primetime address, Bloomberg's Jordan Fabian, a White House correspondent for us, is here with me in Washington. Jordan, obviously it's going to be a very big moment for the president. Do we have any idea what exactly it is, first and foremost, that he wants to say?
The only hint that we have is from that Twitter post that he put up saying it's about what he plans to do in this final months in office and the road ahead, whatever that means. And what I would take it to mean is, look, this is a legacy affirming speech for Joe Biden. One-term presidents aren't usually viewed as consequential figures in the U.S. And so this is a chance for him to talk about everything he did and also what he plans to accomplish with his remaining months in office, like maybe a ceasefire in the Israel-Hamas war, and also talk about the election and Kamala Harris as handpicked successor.
Well, as you talk about the Israel-Hamas war, it is worth pointing out that the other big event today, in addition to Biden's speech, is Netanyahu's speech before a joint session of Congress. We know that Biden and Netanyahu will be meeting tomorrow. Is there a sense that he's going to be diminished in terms of the leverage he will hold over the Israeli government now that he has effectively made himself a lame duck? He is only going to be a one-term president. Does that change his ability to maneuver here as he pushes for a ceasefire?
I think it's hard not to see him that way, especially with this election coming up. And for Netanyahu, a candidate on the Republican side, Donald Trump, whom he was quite close with when Donald Trump was president. And so there might be an instinct for a lot of foreign leaders to wait and to see what happens in the election before making big commitments to Joe Biden, given he's not going to be around come January 2025. That being said, Biden's going to exert all the leverage he can, mainly in the form of weapons, et cetera, to try and get this deal done, as he knows that this would be a legacy-defining achievement for him if it were to happen.
Yeah, of course, we're really working within a 6-month window here if he wants to see this done during his presidency. But when we think about the idea that he's going to lay out what else other than a ceasefire he wants to accomplish, how realistic do we need to be about this? Because the House, after an early morning vote tomorrow, is gone until September 9th. They're taking a long summer recess. Then we're going to be very quickly in just full election mode ahead of November. So realistically, it's just that lame duck session at the end there when he could do anything legislatively, right? So does this mean we could see more executive actions coming from him? And if so, about what?
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if you saw executive actions, especially on immigration or some other things he didn't get done, like gun control. Wouldn't be surprised if you saw another effort to pass aid for Ukraine going into 2025, given, again, the uncertainty of who might be in office, a Republican who's been skeptical about that aid. And also, look, I mean, there's a lot of things that could happen at the end of a presidency, like pardons, et cetera, that are surprising. So I would be tuned for all of that.
When you say pardon, I automatically thought about his son, Hunter Biden. But he, of course, has sworn that he wasn't going to do anything with his case.
He has sworn he wouldn't, but I'm sure that a lot of people are going to be asking and looking to see what he does about that. Exactly. Right? And he's not trying to have a second term anymore. Just before we let you go, Jordan, of course, you mentioned that he has thrown his full support behind his vice president, Kamala Harris. She herself is in Indianapolis today after a visit to Wisconsin yesterday. She's going to be in Texas tomorrow. She certainly is not wasting any time here. Of course, there's not that much time to waste as this election and the convention more specifically is coming up very quickly. I'm hearing a lot about the prospect that she may need to choose her vice presidential pick within the next week so that they can get it on the ballot, get all organized before the DNC. Does that mean that the short list is getting shorter as we understand it? I'm sure that's the case. I mean, there is, as you alluded to, a nominating process that's going to happen before the convention in mid-August. And so I'm not sure, technically with the rules, like what might be required, but I'm sure she wants that person in as soon as possible, not only to make sure there's no legal challenges, but also to get them on the road, and because they don't have time, they don't have time to waste in this campaign.
No, the clock is definitely ticking. I believe those rules are getting finalized by the Democratic National Committee today. Bloomberg's Jordan Fabian, White House correspondent, been busy like the rest of us here in the last several weeks. Thank you so much. And as we consider the vice president and her very early days presidential campaign, it is only technically the third full day of that. And yet we have seen a lot happen in the last 3 days. As I just mentioned, she's already been on the road. She went to Milwaukee. She, of course, went to the campaign headquarters in Wilmington, Delaware earlier this week. She's also been raising a lot of money, more than $100 million in just a 36-hour period, securing the endorsements from pretty much everyone within the Democratic Party. She's been busy. The question is she already making a difference in terms of what the polls look like as we look towards November? We're starting to get some very early readings, including one that came out yesterday from Reuters and Ipsos, that finds Kamala Harris up 2 points to Trump nationally, 44-42. It is within the margin of error, but we wanted to dig into this a little bit more. So Cliff Young is here. He is Ipsos's president of US Public Affairs, with me in our Washington, D.C. studio. So Cliff, obviously, this is a national poll. There is a margin of error here that she is within in terms of her lead against Donald Trump. What I found interesting is that when you add in RFK Jr., who is a factor in this election, at least in some states, as a third party, her lead expands outside the margin of error, 42-38. It's an early read, but a good one for her campaign. Yeah, 4 points. And if you look at her favorability scores compared to before her assumption of where she is versus now, they've gone up 5 points. So overall, things have been shaken up. The voter is reflecting right now. This might be a momentary bump, but it is real. Mm. And of course, when we consider where the bumps matter the most, it's not just about how it reflects across the country, but in a very few specific states, including the one that she visited yesterday, Wisconsin, one of these key swing battleground states that we're watching. Would you expect to see, knowing that Joe Biden was by and large across polls consistently lagging Donald Trump in all of those swing states, and perhaps even a larger margin as we got toward the end of his effort there, that she could see an immediate advantage in those states, or does it matter who her vice presidential pick is to consider those numbers? Yeah, the vice presidential pick doesn't really matter. It's the principle that really matters for people. It's a primary individual on the ticket. We're going to have to wait a couple weeks when it comes to those polls in those key swing states. But what we know right now, based on our national poll, is that she's running much better against those key constituencies that Biden had a problem with. Younger Americans, less affluent Americans, minorities, all key, once again, segments that the Democrats need to win the election. Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because a interested parties memo circulated today from the Harris campaign chair, Jen O'Malley Dillon, of course, fresh off the Biden campaign, about the path to victory. And in it, she talked about how 7% of voters, this is her words, remain undecided in these races. Disproportionately, they are Black, Latino, and under 30. They are more likely to have supported the Biden-Harris ticket in 2020 and are 2 times more likely to be Democrats than Republicans. She talks about them being additional persuadable voters. What do you think about that, Cliff? I think they're right on mark. I call them the inflation orphans. They were really disproportionately affected by inflation. They still have problems making ends meet. And Biden and the Biden administration have been unable to connect with them. Yes, they're in the game. They're in the equation. And really, if the Democrats can bring them into the fold, the Harris campaign can bring them into the fold, it will improve their chances considerably. So it's all about the economy issue at the end of the day. And especially when I just look at the stories we're following at Bloomberg today, we now have the NASDAQ 100 down at the lows of the session by about 3%. Obviously, these inflation orphans may be the people who care more about prices at the grocery store than in the stock market, if you're lucky enough to have a 401k, et cetera. But we also have commentary from the likes of Bill Dudley, formerly of the New York Fed, talking about how the Fed needs to cut or there could be a recession. As we consider the timing at which economic developments could come, now that we're 4 months out from an election, is any incrementally bad news for the economy, by extension, bad news for Kamala Harris because she is attached to this administration, or is she insulated enough from that narrative?
No, it would impact her negatively. I think the signals are mixed. We have multiple surveys, different surveys running that suggest the inflation issue is attenuating, that price sensitivity is going down, which is very important for these key constituencies. So again, any sort of negative news is really bad and will have an immediate probably impact. For the Harris campaign, for the Democrats, they have to hope for a slightly better economy going into November than there is today.
And maybe some rate cuts as well, though that's an open question. As we consider the idea that the economy usually is issue number one, followed very closely by issue number two, which is the border. We have already seen a concerted effort among the Republican Party, certainly the Trump-Vance ticket, to talk about her failure as the quote-unquote border czar. Is the border the issue that could dog Harris the most?
No, this is really a base issue. This is an issue for the Republican base, perhaps on the margins with independents, but there are other issues, including the economy, that are more important. This is really doubling down on the base, showing the base that they've redirected the campaign towards a new adversary, and it's not one that mobilizes or demobilizes the Democratic base.
What mobilizes the Democratic base, at least one of the issues we understand to be abortion, an issue that she, as vice president, has focused very heavily on. But the question we keep asking is that an issue that not only people vote on, but will drive them to the polls and force them to turn out, as we saw in the midterms in 2022? For example, what does your latest polling suggest about the potency of that?
Yeah, we don't know. It's unclear to what extent it will be a driver. She's strong on it. I believe it reinforces her credibility overall as a candidate. And it perhaps helps on the margins in some of the swing states, especially with suburban women, maybe suburban women Republicans. But I would say it's not a secondary, but it's a marginal issue relative to the economy. And
as we consider the idea that could be a turnout issue ultimately, I was struck, this was in Politico this morning, Vote.org, in the 2 days after Biden dropped out, says it saw its highest levels of new voter registration of the whole cycle, a 700% spike with more than 38,000 registrations, most of them under 34. How should we be considering the way in which the youth vote and that specific demographic could change now that this entire race has been upended? Well,
definitely there's more energy. And she's really generating that energy. I think younger people can more identify with her and with her policies. But will young people actually show up on Election Day and vote? That's always the question. Well, and we know that one of the issues young people have had, especially, or at least was the case with Biden and his campaign, was over Israel and Gaza. And we are feeling that in Washington right now. There's protesters everywhere as Netanyahu gets prepared to deliver this joint address to Congress. How does Harris play off that issue, knowing her husband, for example, is Jewish? She has been pro-Israel, but is seen perhaps as more progressive. How can she navigate that issue and not lose support among some of these key constituencies? Well, I think she's probably in a better place than Biden, especially as we think about, let's say, Michigan, which could have been extremely problematic for the Democrats. It's a tricky issue. She wants to stay in the middle, not going too much to the one side or the other. To the extent that she can stay away from it, I would. But I think she's a better overall figure when it comes to that issue relative to Biden. All right, Cliff Young, always good to see you here in our Washington, D.C. studio with some great polling. We'll continue to watch the Ipsos polling as we get it, especially in some of those swing states. It's still early days, of course, so a lot of things have to go out into the field. Cliff, we appreciate it.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
So as we look ahead, let's bring in Laura Davison. She is Bloomberg politics editor here with me in Washington. Laura, this is going to be a big moment for Biden. We have only seen him speak from the Oval Office very rarely during this term. How much of this is a legacy speech and how much of this is a campaign speech, even though he is not the one that is campaigning?
It's kind of 50-50. And you even note that the campaign element of this, the Trump campaign has picked up on this and said, look, we want equal time, which is technically an election rule here. But this is going to be the first time that we will hear from Biden on video in his own words about what this moment means. So he announced this decision that he would not run for re-election in a post on X. We did hear his voice a little bit when he called in to talk talk with campaign staffers when Harris went to Wilmington to meet with what was now her campaign team. But this is the first time we'll see him. He's been down with COVID. And so there's going to be a lot of questions about how he looks, and does he seem at peace with what the situation is?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, Laura, because in the aftermath of his decision to leave the race, we have seen circulating, especially in Republican circles, questions about if he is not fit to stand for re-election and to campaign, why is he still fit to sit in the Oval Office? How much tonight does he have to address the questions around his vitality and his mental acuity, his ability to continue to do this job for the next few months?
I expect that he won't address that specifically, but more in just how he presents himself. There's also an argument that Democrats are making of, look, 6 months is very different than 4 more years. And, the president has been doing the job for 3.5 years so far, that unless there's a major health disclosure, and there's been a lot of updates from his doctors in recent days that have all said that he is fit to serve as president.
Well, and he, as you mentioned, when he called into the headquarters of the campaign in Wilmington, Delaware, talked about how he would be on the campaign trail, not on the ticket, but in support of the woman he endorsed, his vice president, Kamala Harris. What role should we expect him to play dividing the responsibilities of being president and being surrogate for your vice president in a re-election campaign, knowing we haven't seen a vice president of a sitting president doing this in several election cycles?
This is both unprecedented, maybe unprecedented too, and just what this looks like. But this is going to be a tricky thing for him to balance. Being, at the top of the ticket and being, sort of the party's standard bearer for years, he now has to both figure out how to let Harris shine, let her take her own direction. But of course, he is still president. He is still the man in charge, but needs to give her enough breathing room and also give her enough legislating, give her enough, kind of executive power to show that she can do the job. We see that this week with Netanyahu in town. She's meeting with Netanyahu, but separately from Biden, to sort of kind of be able to kind of go out there on her own.
Yeah. And of course, that Netanyahu meeting is happening tomorrow because she's in Indianapolis today after being in Milwaukee yesterday. She's going to be in Texas tomorrow. She certainly is on the move, and things are on the move within the Democratic Party as it consolidates around her. Obviously, rules being decided on today by the Democratic National Committee. I've had a lot of questions about we know the DNC starts April 19th, but if you're trying to get on a ballot and you're facing an August 7th deadline, how quickly all of this will happen, not just for Harris when it comes to a virtual roll call vote, but also for potentially her vice president. How does all of this have to work in terms of sequencing in the next few weeks?
Yeah, so it's a really incredibly compressed timeline. It was just Sunday that, she basically kind of came out as the nominee. It was clear by Monday there was going to be no serious challenges to her. She locked it up Monday night. She's now signaling that she will have someone picked by sort of the August 7th is what the DNC has sort of suggested. So in, the next 10 days or so, she'll have that decided. And then, then we'll roll right into the DNC when they'll officially get the nomination. So it's going to be very tightly turned. Her campaign right now is vetting different candidates. And, right now it's looking like it might be someone like Roy Cooper of North Carolina, Mark Kelly of Arizona, or even potentially Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania.
One of our political panelists, Lester Munson of BGR Group, was suggesting maybe look at Mark Warner, get some national security experience from the Democrat from Virginia, but he's not on any short list, at least that we've heard about. Laura Davison, Bloomberg Politics Editor, thank you so much. Let's get back to Lester now. Joined today, of course, he being our Republican strategist, by our signature Democratic panelist, Jeanne Zaino of Iona University. We can talk more about Harris, but I do want to begin first with this speech we're going to get from Biden in prime time tonight. I just asked this question of Laura, Jeanne, but to what extent does he need to make this a speech about his legacy and his presidency? And to what extent does he need to make this a speech about the potential of a Harris presidency?
I think he's going to balance those things. There has been a lot of goodwill from Democrats, and I'm sure many Americans, towards Joe Biden since he made this really difficult decision to step down or withdraw from the race. And so I think that he would, play on that goodwill, talk about what he has done, what he hopes to do in his remaining 5 to 6 months. And of course, that is setting up for his legacy. And of course, support his vice president, who he has endorsed. So I think we will see all three of those things. This is the first time we have seen a sitting president in this position. Many Americans were not alive when Lyndon Johnson came out in 1968 to make this speech. So it is a really important moment for Americans, and one that we are not used to, somebody stepping aside and opening the door for somebody else.
Yeah, it's an excellent point. The parallels to 1968 continue to be drawn, not least of which is because Like in 1968, the Democratic Convention also is going to be held in Chicago this time around. What do they say about history and rhyming? But Lester, I wonder to the extent that we know that Republicans have an issue with Joe Biden continuing to be in the Oval Office, if there are questions about his ability to be vigorous and be out on the campaign trail, their suggestion is, why should he be able to be in the Oval Office? Is he able to put those concerns to bed with this address tonight? And frankly, is it still a productive line of inquiry or smart way to spend political capital for Republicans right now? Should they just be focusing on Harris instead?
I think the answer to all of your questions is no, Kailey. By the way, I remember the LBJ speech in, I think it was March of 1968. I was 6 months old, and I've had this weird sense of deja vu for the last 3 days. I did ask my dad, did I see that on TV? Yes, I did. So I've been around for both of them. I think President Biden does have an issue to show he can do the job. He needs to show that really every single day for the next 6 months. This is not something that will be put to bed by one speech. He's got to continually demonstrate that, because I think Americans have questions, and it is fair for them to have questions about that. So this speech tonight is, I think it's entirely about his legacy, because his legacy is, I'm the guy who kicked Donald Trump out of the White House, and I'm going to keep him out by handing the baton to Kamala Harris in November. That's what he's shooting for the legacy here. So I think this is not just a campaign speech, not just a legacy speech. It's all of it tied into one package. I think the Republicans, for them to have a chance, for former President Trump to have a chance in November, and his chance is much smaller now than it used to be, he's got to make this about Kamala Harris and her record and how she will govern as president. The bump that she's getting now is very significant. She's raising a lot of money, but it's going to fade over time in terms of popularity. The Republicans need to be in a place where they're offering a clear alternative to how she would govern this country. Whether they're going to be able to do that or not remains to be seen. But I think going after the guy in the office right now, Joe Biden, is a mistake. He can demonstrate his fitness or not. I think the Republicans would be better suited just let him do that.
Well, Jeanne, as Lester talks about here, the idea that Harris does need to have her record out there, and it's her record up against Donald Trump's ultimately in November. We've talked a lot in the last few days about the idea that she herself may need to create some separation from President Biden and what the administration has done in terms of policy. But to what extent is Biden also responsible for creating that separation for her? Should he be drawing distinctions between the way he thinks and the way she thinks?
No, I think Biden should be in a position where he talks about the positive things he is handing over to her. And there is a laundry list. I mean, we cannot forget when he came into office in 2020, 2021, very few of us expected that he would pass any major piece of legislation, let alone the number that he did, because Congress was so divided. So he has a lot to be proud of, and he hands, as Lester said, the baton to her. And it is up to her to differentiate herself. And whether that's going to be on an issue like we're talking a lot about today, the Middle East and Gaza, whether that's going to be on the issue of inflation. I've been paying careful attention to what she's been talking about. And one thing she has worked on independently of Biden, amongst many, is housing. That is a huge cost of living concern for Americans. We've seen Biden try to tap into that. I think we may see her differentiate herself even more on that kind of issue. But again, I think that is up to Kamala Harris to do. And Joe Biden needs to talk about handing the baton smoothly over to her. And I have to say, and I don't say this lightly, so far, so good on the Democrat side making this handover. I thought it was going to be a lot bumpier than it is, 72, 96 hours in.
Well, Jeanne, I'm glad you raised Israel. In our final minutes here, Lester, of course, we are awaiting this address from Netanyahu at 2 p.m. Eastern time in Congress. Biden's going to be meeting with him tomorrow as well, as we've discussed. To what extent, knowing that you co-head the international practice at BGR, to what extent does Biden lose leverage as he pushes for a ceasefire, something we understand he wants to see accomplished during his first and what will be his only presidential term? If he wants to see a ceasefire done, does Netanyahu now have less incentive, I guess is the way to say it, because he knows Biden is effectively now a lame duck to agree to what Biden wants?
I think Netanyahu's focused on the security of the state of Israel. Of course, he's focused on his own political stability and whether he can remain in office and whether his government will survive. I think the best way to address both of those things is to engage proactively with the Biden administration on its efforts to come to a ceasefire in Gaza. Israel has largely achieved, not completely, but largely achieved its military aims in Gaza. There's a clear pivot coming. And I think the prime minister knows at the end of the day, his most important relationship in the world is with Washington. He needs to have bipartisan strength. The Republicans are just fine for him. He really needs to shore up his standing with the administration and congressional Democrats. This is a big weak spot for him. I think the best thing he can do is embrace the work that Biden and his people have done. I say this as a Republican. The best thing Netanyahu can do is embrace the peace plan, the work that has been done by American diplomats, and engage with them on finding a solution here. He can't look like he's the obstacle. That is going to be a big problem for him, and it will be a problem for the relationship between the U.S. and Israel also.
All right, Lester Munson and Jeanne Zaino, our political panel today. Thank you both so much.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
And I would note it's not just outside groups that are showing up to protest here in D.C. today. There are some protests happening within the Capitol itself and the lawmakers that spend a lot of their time there, as many Democrats have chosen not to attend Netanyahu's address, in part because of disagreements over the way in which the Israeli government is handling the ongoing war in Gaza. We turn now to one of those lawmakers. I'm pleased to welcome back to Bloomberg TV and Radio Democratic Congressman Bera of California. Sir, welcome back to Bloomberg. It's always great to have you. Obviously, you have made the decision not to listen to Netanyahu speak today. Why not just hear what he has to say?
Kailey, thanks for having me back on. I wouldn't characterize it as a protest, but I would characterize it, I don't agree with how he's prosecuting the war at this stage. I do think you have a real tangible ceasefire deal that's on the table that could pause the war and hopefully get to a permanent ceasefire, but could also allow the release of hostages. The reason why I made the decision that I did in terms of not attending is after meeting with families of hostages, American hostages, yesterday, the one ask they had of us was to put pressure on Benjamin Netanyahu to agree to the ceasefire deal, to publicly agree to it. And he's not meeting with us here on the Hill. So this is one way that I thought I could make a statement to try to get to that ceasefire deal and get the families that have loved ones being held hostage released.
So, Congressman, do you think that Republicans in your chamber, in Congress more widely, are putting that pressure on Netanyahu? Or does the pressure by and large have to come from the executive branch and President Biden?
I think the pressure should come from all of us because there should be a paramount urgency. It's 292 days that people have been held hostage in really cramped quarters. We heard from one survivor who was released back in the last hostage release about how horrific the conditions were. So I think there is an urgency to put pressure on the prime minister to accept this ceasefire, to publicly say so, and then look for a path forward. There is an opportunity to normalize relations with Saudi Arabia, with the other Arab countries, to expand on the Abraham Accords and think about a different future here. And I'm in full support of Israel. I think Israel is a Jewish state that we should protect. But I would like to see a different future for the whole Middle East.
Well, we know that President Biden, together with Prime Minister Netanyahu, will be meeting with the families of American hostages that are still being held by Hamas tomorrow after their bilateral meeting at the White House. But Congressman, you and I both know, as do they, that this meeting is happening in the context of what has been an incredible week in U.S. politics with Biden's decision not to seek re-election. Are you concerned that his ability to exercise leverage over Netanyahu and the Israeli government is now diminished because of his decision not to seek a second term?
No, because I think President Biden has been a steadfast supporter of Israel, but he's also made hard decisions, and he's had very direct conversations with Prime Minister Netanyahu. I think what President Biden did last Sunday was the symbol of character and leadership, putting country first. And I think that's what we're asking Prime Minister Netanyahu to do. I understand the political risk that he has in terms of holding his coalition of hard-right individuals in Israel together. But listening to the family of the hostages, understanding what I hear from leading Israeli security officials and others, this is a good ceasefire. They negotiated it. They agreed to it. I don't expect Hamas or Sinwar to necessarily agree to the terms of the deal, but let's put the pressure on them by actually having Prime Minister Netanyahu come out and say he supports the ceasefire deal that's been negotiated. Now, if Sinwar doesn't, the pressure and focus is on him.
Yeah, and I wonder to what extent we'll hear about how Joe Biden wants a ceasefire achieved during the remainder of his presidency when he addresses the nation from the Oval Office in prime time tonight, Congressman. We also expect that he may have some words about his Vice President Kamala Harris. When it comes specifically to the issue of Israel, how would you expect her policy would differ if she were elected in November?
I think if she's elected in November, I think she would continue some of the same policies of the Biden administration. I think she might be a little bit more forceful in saying the time is now for a ceasefire. There's a humanitarian crisis unfolding in Gaza. That is not war. That is something we have the ability to relieve: food, water, medications. There's an urgency to get that done. And I think about that from the perspective of being a doctor. I also, again, I'm not letting Hamas off the hook. I'm not letting Yahya Sinwar off the hook, the military leader of Hamas. What they did on October 7th was atrocious. But I do think for the sake of the Israel that I'd like to see, the Israel that I saw last summer, pre-October 7th, I'd like to see a different future. And I know we're holding the possibility of a deal with Saudi Arabia open, but it gets harder and harder the longer this war continues.
Well, Congressman, I'm glad you raised the humanitarian aspect here because that has been a challenge for the incumbent administration. Does Kamala Harris, if she becomes President Harris, need to do a better job than the administration she's been attached to for the last 3.5 years on that front?
Well, I think President Biden and the team around President Biden have been trying to put as much pressure on the Israelis to allow humanitarian aid to flow freely into Gaza. One of my disagreements with Prime Minister Netanyahu, and another reason why I'm not there, is I think he's been reluctant to allow that aid to flow in. And I think that's a big mistake. And again, my hope is when he gives his address to Congress today, that we hear from him. It's like, it's time for us to end this war. It's time for us to get the hostages home. We've got a good ceasefire deal on the table. Let's accept that ceasefire deal. And now the pressure is on Hamas to accept that deal. I don't know if we'll hear that, but that's what I would love to hear.
Well, I guess we'll all find out just about half an hour from now. As you speak to the humanitarian aspect of all of this as a doctor, I'd like to ask you another question in your capacity, not just as a congressman, but as a doctor, knowing there have been many Republicans, including from within your own chamber, who have suggested that if Biden is not fit to campaign and stand for re-election, he should no longer be fit to sit in the Oval Office. As a doctor, what do you say to that?
As a doctor, I say, I've interacted with the president in recent months. I'm interacting with this team. I've seen the decisions that they're making, that he's making, and I have no reservations about his capacity to run this country and govern.
Well, we'll see what he says about that ability, or if he addresses this at all in his Oval Office speech tonight. We also understand that in part what he wants to accomplish with this speech is to outline the things he would still like to get done in the remainder of his term. He effectively now is a lame duck. You and your colleagues in Congress can't call it the lame duck session quite yet, as we still have an election to get through. But are you hopeful that more legislative accomplishment can come during this administration? And if you are, what would it be?
Yeah, I think we're going to see a vigorous President Biden. I think we're going to see the character and leadership that are the hallmarks of Joe Biden. And I think I'll speak directly to the country about how we move forward. And part of that is that transition to the next generation. But he's still got, there's still a lot going on in the world. You've got a war in Europe. You're trying to end a war in the Middle East, and you're trying to prevent a war in Asia. We've still got a lot to do in terms of rebuilding our economy, jobs, and addressing inflation. I think he'll talk to the things that he hopes to accomplish, and I hope he has a Congress that's willing to work with him.
And Congressman, finally, just on the subject of Congress, you're going to be done for the summer after votes early tomorrow. Everybody's going home or going back to campaign mode until September 9th, which means we're just going to be a few weeks away when you return from the shutdown conversation and when funding expires on September 30th. Just what are you bracing for when you get back to Washington after the summer break?
You know, I know the Republicans had hoped they were able to get their appropriation budget bills across the finish line. They're not able to get their own bills voted on and get enough Republicans to support them. So I hope when we come back, we either have compromise bills that the Senate sent bills over to us, that we fund the government. I would hope that this conflict in Gaza between Israel and Hamas is at a conclusion, that we're talking about what the day after looks like and what next. But there's still a lot of work to do. So let's not fool around with the government shutdown. This is still the United States of America. Let's all work together and show the world how we are still the leaders of the world.
All right, Congressman, it's on that note we will leave it. Thank you so much, as always, for joining us here on Bloomberg TV and radio. That's Democratic Congressman Bera of California. We appreciate your time, sir.
Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.